Yemen have been living with war for more than 3 years. Bombs and bullets have claimed many civilian lives, but there's another pressing threat. 16 million people in Yemen, that's more than half the population, don't have access to safe water. Yemen's an arid country, and even before the war, it was the poorest nation in the Middle East. But since war broke out, water and sanitation infrastructure has been destroyed and left many at risk of disease.
Rubbish hasn't been collected in 2 years in the city. So you see piles of it all over the city. You see sewage, open sewage areas. You see rivers that are just contaminated with household rubbish.
The United Nations recognised access to safe water as a human right in 2010. But that's a little comfort to the many Yemenis who are, quite literally, dying for a drink. In 2011, an Arab Spring uprising forced President Saleh of Yemen to give power to his deputy, President Hadi. The new president met opposition from many sources, including a rebel group of Shia Muslims called the Houthis. In late 2014, the Houthis took over Yemen's capital city, Sana'a, and President Hadi fled the country. Believing that the Houthis were receiving military support from Iran, a coalition of Sunni Muslim states led by Saudi Arabia began an air campaign to reinstate President Hadi. Roger Shanahan from the Lowy Institute explains.
From a geostrategic point of view, Saudi Arabia is and always has been concerned about an insecure southern border. That's its main rationale for trying to maintain stability inside Yemen, and it has normally been happy to subcontract that out to somebody like President Saleh before as a kind of hard man. He looks after the stability of Yemen. Once that stability is no longer guaranteed, it becomes a security threat to Saudi Arabia. The Houthis themselves becomes a bit complex about whether they're a ethnic or social or religious or social group. At their heart, Zaydism or Zaydi Shiism, it's a branch of the Shia faith, but quite different to the Shia mainstream Shiism that we see in Lebanon, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran. There's little doubt that the Iranians have provided some support to the Houthi movement as a way of expanding their influence in the region, but also putting pressure on the Saudis for very little commitment of funding or resources. But it is nowhere near as much as external actors like Saudi Arabia would have people believe.
For civilians, the continuing war in Yemen means constant aerial bombardment by the Saudi coalition, particularly in cities like Taiz. The war has also left the government unable to pay for basic services and infrastructure, like hospitals and the water system. Arun Jegan has recently returned from Yemen, where he was a project coordinator for the NGO Doctors Without Borders. He was based in the city of Taiz.
Taiz is a special place in Yemen. It's pre-1990, it was never really a part of North or South Yemen, even though technically it was a part of the North. It had its own identity. It was considered the cultural and intellectual capital of the country. And now it's destroyed. I mean, the city is in ruins. The challenge right now is that the constant fear of life being threatened or even being injured or wounded is a huge problem. The second thing is actually access to basic amenities, basic access to food, to water, to healthcare. These things are not, they're not a privilege to everyone there. For the some who have the money that can afford this, it's available, but for the majority of the country, it's not. You see a huge percentage of people under the threat of food insecurity, especially in the rural areas. In the city, it's a different story where there's access to these provisions, but the prices are so high that they can't afford it.
According to the UN, 2.9 million Yemeni women and children are acutely malnourished, and 7.5 million people, a quarter of the population of Yemen, need food aid. The Saudi coalition has enforced a blockade of the country, which they say is to stop Iran from importing weapons to support the Houthi forces. But for civilians, the blockade means that food and medicines are scarce and expensive.
Even when everything is working as properly as it can in Yemen, it's still difficult to get supplies to the more outlying areas, just given the nature of Yemen. Putting a squeeze on any kind of economic activity to any degree in Yemen is going to have a knock-on effect to those more isolated areas.
3 years of aerial bombardment has destroyed water piping and water treatment systems in Yemen. 73% of people do not have access to piped drinking water. In many areas, the only potable water is distributed by NGOs.
So in Thai city, what I observed was a lot of water trucking. So you saw a lot of, some, international organizations funding, international and private organizations really funding centralized water trucking areas where people would line up with water cans to do this. In some areas where the water pipes were still working, you would get water there, but the water wasn't potable. Water is a big struggle for people.
In rural areas of Yemen, there are no water trucks to bring safe water to civilians. Many people rely on wells and rivers as a water source, many of which are not safe to drink. Here, MSF field workers distribute water hygiene kits in a village in the Osman Valley.
Beyond the water, if you look at the sanitation aspect of it, rubbish hasn't been collected in 2 years in the city. So you see piles of it all over the city. You see sewage, open sewage areas. You see rivers that are just contaminated with household rubbish because there isn't ways to dispose of it. You see hospitals, right in front of hospitals, you see the disposal of medical waste in front of it. So you can see that it's not just the water situation, but it's also the sanitation aspect that bleeds into the water table, the water issues, and so it needs the water is really having a spiraling effect on all these provisions. The general issue with limited access to safe water is that it increases the risk of outbreak of diseases. I think we saw this very clearly last year when the suspected cholera cases, a huge number of cases were recorded in Yemen as well as Thai city. I think the poor sanitation, the lack of potable water, the lack of clean water led to the rise in these cases.
In 2016 and 2017, Yemen saw the largest documented cholera outbreak in modern times. There were more than 1 million cases reported and 2,300 associated deaths. This footage was taken in June last year at an MSF cholera treatment centre in Khmer. Patients are being treated for cholera with oral rehydration and intravenous fluids in severe cases. Untreated, cholera can lead to severe dehydration and death. An MSF project coordinator, Claire Manera, recounts one such case.
You know that cholera kills so fast. We've had a few very sad cases. One recently, a young boy of 12 years old. The family was coming to us because he had vomiting and diarrhea, but he died just 10 minutes before reaching us at the hospital. And they were travelling for hours to reach us, but they couldn't make it in time.
Since the cholera outbreak, there have been no major upgrades to water and sanitation infrastructure, which means that the threat of another outbreak is ever present.
If the general situation doesn't improve, you'll have risk of outbreak of diseases will definitely be there and even multiply, because I haven't seen a major change in the sanitation system since I've been there.
March 2018 marked 3 years of war in Yemen. Just in the last few days, there's been a push by the Saudi coalition to seize the port city of Hodeidah, but the Houthis remain determined to keep fighting. It seems unlikely that the Yemenis could withstand another 3 years of war.
So 3 years for me is far too long. If the situation continues like this, you'll see an even greater risk of outbreak of diseases. You'll see an even greater risk of malnutrition, even greater risk of food shortages to what it is right now. Right now it's at its critical levels.
If they lose Hodeidah, while they can still survive for a bit, that will be a significant blow to them losing their logistics hub. So I think if that falls, then there's a possibility that the actual fighting might diminish quickly and some kind of a negotiated solution come out. But such is the nature of Yemen that it's unlikely to be a final solution.
There was a shelling at night time on a mountain area, and some kids were playing outside, and one of the kids got wounded, and I remember the mother had to make like a 4-hour journey to the hospital, which usually would have taken a lot less time, but because there was front lines and there were roadblocks, she couldn't do it. She also had to sell her jewelry to pay for the transportation, and then when the boy reached the hospital, he got treated and was caring, and she told me she'd already lost someone, another child due to the war, and there was just a look of, when will this end?
The impact of the war in Yemen is not confined to war wounds. After 3 years of fighting, it's the basic necessities of life, water, food, medicine, that are under threat.